Yes, I love this land. It takes my breath away.
Welcome to Texas 10. If you've been listening to our podcast or watching us on YouTube, you know that we have been traveling around the state of Texas visiting all the county seats.
254 of them.
254. Well, today we're actually going to take a little different bit. We're going to talk about our state capital. If you are familiar with the state capital of Texas, it has a remarkable building. And, you know, Texas has a remarkable history when it comes to the capitals and where our capital buildings were. I'm an educator, and I take my fourth graders to Austin every single year, and we go and we visit the state capital of Texas, and it has a remarkable story.
It does, and we're super lucky today to have a guest who has spent quite a bit of time in the Capitol building. I know you've toured kids through the Capitol.
I have.
But what we wanted was a little more of an insider perspective. So we have Chancellor Brian McCall with us today. I know Brian, or we know Brian from Baylor University, and he has risen to great heights, which going to Baylor will do it for you, some people. And so, Brian, why don't, first of all, you tell us just a little bit about what your current job is?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm Chancellor of the Texas State University System, which is a system of 7 universities all across the state, 100,000 students, 15,000 faculty and staff, doing great things, stamping out ignorance in Texas.
Okay, well, I'm going to not touch that last line. But we talked a little bit off camera about sort of the general mission and some of the things that bring you joy about your job. And I'm just wondering, before we get to the Capitol, because some of the people that you're educating can end up being representatives and senators and governors and that sort of thing, can you sort of repeat for us what is special about the universities that you lead?
Yeah, well, we're the only university system with 2-year schools and 4-year schools. And so in our system, you can get a welding certificate or a medical degree. You can get a Ph.D. or become a dental hygienist. We cover it all. Chemical engineers. It's Lamar University graduates more chemical engineers than any university.
Wow.
And their earnings upon completion are greater than MIT, Stanford, and Harvard. We're all over the board, truck driving to medical doctors. And so we do it all.
All right.
I love what you said about first generation students.
Yeah. We educate a lot of first-generation students. It's very important to us. We can't just hold the door open for them when they arrive as freshmen and say good luck. We've got to make sure they get through the pipeline. No one in their family has been to college before. They have interesting questions about what's next, like what time does school start in the morning? And so we take it very seriously and make sure we get them through the pipeline. I think it would be immoral to admit them and not do everything we can to make sure that they graduate. And so they do. And a first-generation college student will likely marry a college graduate. Their children will become college graduates. It's transformative.
I love that. And the colleges in your system are Texas State,
Sam Houston, Lamar University, Lamar Institute of Technology, Lamar State College Port Arthur, Lamar State College Orange, Sam Houston State University, and Sul Ross State University.
Which is great. And I don't know if we love Alpine, and we'll have that in another episode, but I actually fell in love with Sul Ross when we visited Alpine.
Wonderful,
especially.
beautiful school.
Yeah.
Well, and we'll get to the Capitol here. It did just strike me when you said that the Lamar is for Marabou B. Lamar.
Right.
Sam Houston, of course, is for Sam Houston.
Right.
They were not friends.
They were not friends.
Sul Ross is for another great Texan. And then Texas State is where our first Texan president got his education. So you lead a group of universities that are deeply steeped in Texas history. Right. And we've been to them all.
Right, which leads us to the talks about our capital. And I think the first place to start is When you take this tour, I encourage you to take, if you're retired, I encourage you to go if you've never gone. If you have kids, I encourage you to go. And when we take our kids, we always started with this great little museum that's actually right on the grounds of the Capitol in the old land grant office. It's a smaller museum. There's also the Bob Bullock, which is great. But this little museum tells you so much about Texas history and about the Capitol. And the first place to start is the state capitol was not always in Austin. In fact, it was the last place it landed.
Well, yeah. So, and we've had a lot of, obviously we were a colony, a territory before we were then a nation and then a state. And so let me see if I can track this. They started with Mexico, or there was a capital of the colony that was actually in what is now Mexico. But then the administration moved a little bit to San Antonio, and there's the governor's palace there, which actually wasn't a capitol building, but it was sort of the actual administrative office. Been to Nacogdoches for a little bit. And then
Washington on the Brazos.
Then Washington on the Brazos. Well, actually before that, San Felipe de Austin.
Right.
And then when we set up at Washington on the Brazos, then we had to move very quickly to a variety of places. I think they went to Galveston, Velasco, and then to Houston or West Columbia.
Harrisburg, West Columbia.
Right, and then Houston. And unfortunately, all of those places, there's a couple of buildings that have been erected as replicas of those, but we don't have any of those buildings.
I did think it was interesting. Houston really wanted to be the capital of Texas. And as it turned out, it was kind of an outlaw city. And I loved reading about how Houston was an outlaw city, so that was a problem. And it was also quite marshy, and they just decided that wasn't the place. And so they had this beautiful place called in Austin, which was a very small kind of territory. And it was controversial because it was in the middle of nowhere. They thought the Comanches would be a problem, but Austin won out because of its beauty, I guess. And so that's why our capital is in Austin. That's where it's landed, and that's where it has stayed.
Brilliant pick. I'm so pleased they didn't. Pick Dime Box or Muleshoe. Or nothing wrong with those places, but Austin's the right place.
And I will say, here at Texas 10, we have been to every one of the sites of every capital here in Texas, which is really pretty fun and cool.
So tell us first a little bit, because you're an Austin resident, and I'm guessing, given your job, you frequently visit the Capitol. Is that right?
I do. Both capitals. I'm in D.C. and Austin Capitol a good bit. Testified before the Senate last week. It's a big part of my job. I've had to learn how to stand on my own two knees. But what a beautiful building to work in. When it was built, Texas was absolutely broke. And they built what was then one of the top 11 buildings in terms of size in the world, a magnificent structure. It's now the largest single-family home in America because the Speaker has an apartment there. And it's an inspiring place to work.
And I think there's a couple of things about what you just said. One, I think the way it got built was such a Texan way of doing things. And for a lot of people know this, but for the uninitiated, or if you haven't studied it, the building obviously was going to cost a lot of money, right? And Texans, being Texans, were land rich and cash poor, right? And so what did we decide to do to actually get this thing built? Are you familiar with the XIT?
Tell me.
Barter.
That's right. So it was the largest barter transaction in history. And there was a group out of Chicago that said, well, we want a lot of Texas land, and we'll build your capital. And they took land up in the Panhandle. Okay, good for them. And turned it into the XIT Ranch, which became the largest ranch in the world. And so that's how something way up in the Panhandle is connected to our to Austin and sort of binds us together as a state, I would say. So that is a Texan way to finance the building of the Capitol. And then it's big. It is really big.
You mentioned you've been to the national capital and the state capital, and yes, Texas's capital is taller than the United States Capitol. Our dome is taller, but we're not we're not the only state with that distinction. There are what?
I think we might have been the first state.
We might have been the first, but there are other states who did the same. But our capital is bigger than our own
And to
countries.
get the Goddess of Liberty, this beautiful marble statue atop it, was quite a feat. When Ann Richards was governor, they renovated the Capitol and did a lot of work and actually took the Goddess of Liberty off. And they did it by helicopter and put it back by helicopter. And even with helicopter, it was quite a challenge. Ann Richards was asked at the time, what shall we put atop the Capitol dome while the Goddess of Liberty is down? And she said a big star, a huge Christmas star. And in fact, a big star was put upon the top of the Capitol. Her reasoning, she said, was that perhaps it might attract a few wise men. And the Republicans' retort to that was, sure enough, George Bush came.
I think that's the greatest thing, is the folklore behind so many of our stories. Speaking of the Goddess of Liberty, when she was originally sculpted, she was sculpted in 80 separate pieces, and then they welded her together into 4 larger pieces. And of course, then they didn't have helicopters, but they hoisted her up. I can only imagine, how they did that, hoisted her up and then put her together on top of the dome with large screws. And so it's a remarkable story how the original became. And then I loved this story. So they painted, the original painting she was all in white, and some other painter came along and painted her hair black and painted her dress blue. And that lasted for a few years, and then they returned her to all white.
I didn't know that.
Thank you for researching that, Melissa.
You're welcome.
Right. Okay.
I told you I loved her.
Right.
And I love there was a woman on top of our Capitol, just saying.
Well, and I love the Ann Richards and George Bush stories. We're not political here on Texas 10, but I love humor in politics, and I love both sides being able to sort of arrive at that. And those were 2 of the best. They are both funny people.
I served with them both. Loved them both.
Right. And so you mentioned you served. You've talked about your current job. You were a state representative too, correct?
For 20 years.
Right. So that's a long time to be a state representative.
Longer for the constituents than for me.
So talking about the building, let's go back to, because we talked about how the acquisition of the land and we bartered to get it built. But not only that, but talk about the structure itself and how it is very Texan with Texas material.
Right. So, well, first of all, just you tell me, when you look at the building, right, especially if it's sunset or golden hour or whatnot, what's your impression of the building itself, just visually? What appeals to you?
Well, let me tell you, I worked in the building for 20 years as a legislator. For 15 years, I've worked in the building as a chancellor. I still am inspired every time I'm in it, around it, look at it. It's an amazing structure. It's kept as one of the cleanest public buildings in the world. Every year it's announced that it's in the top 5 cleanest, well-kept buildings in the world, public buildings. The people that have gone through the halls, U.S. presidents. The fact that Texas is Texas, if you're a curious individual and want to be a legislator, it's the best place to be, because the best minds in the nation go through that building every session, because what happens in Texas spreads to the other states. What happens in California, New York, and Texas happens in the other states. And so the best minds in the world, you see Denton Cooley, you see scientists, Elon Musk, whomever, they pass through the building. And my prediction is they're inspired by the architecture as well.
And I at sunset, I mean, it is inspiring. I think that's really the adjective that grabs your mind. And part of that comes from the marble that is on the outside. And the interesting story behind that is that originally it was going to be an all limestone building. And the problem with that was it sort of discolored, and you would see a little rust on it. It didn't weather very well. And so they clad it with marble from Marble Falls, Texas. And again, in sort of a Texan way to approach things, that was going to be expensive, the marble, to get it there. And a group of businessmen said, we'll donate the marble if we can build a railroad track, and we're going to try and popularize the rail with that. And so that's how we got free marble to clad our building that still is inspiring today. And I think it adds to it. And that's how it got there. And one of the side notes is they made the turns a little bit sharp coming from Burnett or Burnett. Oh no. We'll get Burnett. We'll get Burnett mail now that or Marble Falls, and there was granite that would fall off, and it was cheaper because it was being donated. You didn't stop and try and get it back on the train; you just left it there. So there are little outcroppings of granite between Marble Falls and Austin and the Capitol, where the rail line used to be. That people like to say, "Hey, that would have been part of the Texas Capitol." But the end result is, like you said, inspiring, really spectacular. It has a unique, aura about it. And I think that comes from the building materials, a lot of it.
And the grounds itself, they're stunning. They're beautiful. They have several monuments around the grounds that have been there. The first was the monument for the Alamo, to remember the Alamo. And there's just beautiful monuments. We would always take our kids, like I said, we would start at that little museum, and then we would go to the Capitol. We would eat on the grounds. And then, if it wasn't raining, and then we would go into the Capitol building. And when you walk in, so when imagine you're a fourth grade, first time you're really learning about Texas history. I was passionate about teaching it. And our kids love the history. We have such a storied, colorful history. And of course, one of their favorite stories is when Santa Anna, what's the word? Turns himself in. Surrenders. Thank you. And there is a beautiful, famous painting of him and Sam Houston under the tree, Santa Anna surrendering, and it's right there as you walk in. And there's also a beautiful portrait of Davy Crockett, because that's every boy's favorite character is Davy Crockett. And so to walk in and see those paintings that were in their history books and then get to see them up close and personal is really very cool. And that's kind of the first thing that greets you. And I love that.
And you have Sam Houston, a statue on one side, Stephen F. Austin on another. You go through the building and there are paintings of Barbara Jordan, the first African-American woman in the South elected to a position of that nature, first African-American woman elected to Congress. You have Jim Wright. You have Audie Murphy. It's just the Texans that have been in that building, worked in that building, and the stories are amazing. The building has been used to create legislation. It has been used as a house of worship. There is a chapel. It has been used as a house of ill repute. It was open 24 hours a day for most of its history. And the third floor, for a long period of time, a blind eye was turned to what was being done at night on the third floor.
Okay, so I read a whole article about the myths of the Capitol, but that wasn't listed.
It's not a myth.
It's because it wasn't a myth.
Well, it's myth and legend.
Right.
The article I read was myth and legend.
Well, that's legendary. That's not mythical.
Wow. And they didn't tell us that on the tour with the kids.
Well, the tour and the article that you read are more wholesome than your guest today.
Wow. So was that recently?
No. Fortunately, it was not recently, no.
So
wow.
that is quite the story. And I'm going to segue and say that if hopefully we spark an interest, and if you're really interested, there's a great book by a historian by the name of Michael Cox, and it is The Lore and Legends of the Texas State Capitol. It's fairly recently written, and I would recommend that to anybody that wants to learn a little bit more about what we're talking about today. So, but back to the conversation. And I'm not paid for that. That's a real.
So, and just thinking about the building of the Capitol, and I think you always remember dates better than I do, but I loved kind of the timeline of how it was built and when the cornerstone was laid. And
well, so when I was doing a little bit of research, that really spoke to me because the legislation was passed and signed into law for the Capitol on February 15th, which Melissa can tell you is
Steve's birthday.
Right. So that spoke to me.
Big day.
In 1879, they laid the cornerstone on March 2nd, 1885, I believe, which March 2nd is Texas Independence Day. And then it wasn't quite finished, but they went ahead and opened it to the public on April 21st, 1888. And April 21st is, of course, San Jacinto Day, where the battle occurred. I don't think the surrender painting, I think that was a day or two later, when they finally found Santa Anna in a corporal's uniform trying to get back and skunk his way out.
Coward.
So that did speak to me quite a bit. But then, as you remarked, there's been extensive renovations on it over time.
Yes.
You remarked how it's also a resident because of the apartment. In the 80s, there was, and I really didn't remember this, it was in 83, there was a fire in Hobby's apartment, which
That's correct.
led to some of the renovation.
That's correct. And Mr. Hobby chose not to rebuild the apartment. And so our governor has a residence, our speaker has a residence, but the poor lieutenant governor is on his own or her own.
Because he burned it down.
Yeah.
Well, and you say the poor lieutenant governor. We're going to segue because we're talking about the Capitol, a little bit about Texas government structure. The lieutenant governor of Texas actually has quite a bit of power. Is that correct?
As does the speaker.
Right. And you actually wrote a book about how some people, like our form of government, might be perceived by political scientists as having less power in the governor's mansion than in some other states, but the personalities that have inhabited our governor's mansion have managed to change that. What's the book?
That's true. Historically, the governor's office was designed to be weak since Reconstruction, but subsequently we have been empowering the governor through statute and various constitutional amendments. And so now it's not such a weak governor process. But the power of the personality of the governor can make it much stronger than it is, just as the power of the presidency can do the same.
Well, and so when you have somebody who rose to be president as governor, and Ann Richards, sort of just to name two that you had mentioned, those are some pretty powerful personalities. All right. So as most fourth graders who studied under M'Lissa would know, we have a bicameral system, and there's a Senate wing and a representative wing, right? Tell us a little bit about the difference between sort of just the accoutrements in those two places.
Well, I believe those senators who served in the House, we call it being housebroken, are the best legislators on that side of the aisle. Right. A lot of senators come from the House, and that has always been the case. And I think that that's important. The House originates all tax bills, and the budget goes from House to House, session to session, as to who originates that. They're equally powerful. A House member can kill a Senate bill just as a senator can kill a House bill. And it works very well.
Right. And that is sort of modeled after the United States Constitution.
And if you go to the Capitol building, there's nothing better. It's great when they're in session. I do think that's very valuable, just to go and sit in the lobby and just watch a little. But with our kids, we have found it's been even more powerful if they're not in session and they get to sit, because they will let you in and you can sit in the places where our representatives and our senators sit. And those desks, they've been there forever.
Yeah, I sat for 18 of my 20 years at Lyndon Johnson's father's desk.
Oh, wow.
On the House floor. And it's the history is great. If you do go when the House is in session, there's a great example of what happens. They say that a man or a woman gets up to speak, says nothing, nobody listens, and then they argue about it. And that's what it appears to be happening from the gallery. Right.
Okay, so at those desks, let's go back to legends. And I mean, what are some stories about people sitting in those desks? And, I'm sure there's been, they didn't used to have mics, now they have mics. Just, is there any great stories about what's happened while someone's been sitting at one of those desks?
Oh, absolutely. When I was first elected, we had spittoons at each desk. And
still,
yeah, we did. We had spittoons.
And so, did you partake?
No, but some poor schmuck had to clean those at night. We passed a law that said you could not smoke in any building, any state building in Texas except the Capitol. And that's because we had colleagues whose votes we needed that wanted to smoke on the Capitol floor. Great things happened in the building. Ralph Hall, who was a state senator.
East Texas, right?
Rockwall.
Rockwall,
okay.
right.
Rockwall,
Okay.
Rockwall. Went on to become a great congressman, a wonderful man. gunshots were heard in the basement of the Capitol one night, and DPS came running in to find Senator Hall and another senator standing on a desk with handguns drawn, and apparently they were shooting mice. And so I asked Congressman Hall about this. I said, can this be true that gunshots were heard and you were standing on a desk with another senator with handguns drawn shooting mice? And he laughed and smiled and said, no, we were shooting cockroaches.
But in Texas,
Right.
they're the size
Right.
of mice.
Exactly.
Well, actually, that's probably more Florida than Texas, but still.
And then I remember, this is a hazy memory and it may be a myth, but I remember stories about the legendary Bo Pilgrim on the floor. Tell us about that.
So we had a wave of ethics reform after Bo Pilgrim was on the Senate floor pulling envelopes out of his pocket, handing checks to senators, campaign donations. Actually, while the Senate was in session, they were on a break, so he was able to come on the floor. And so that just didn't pass the smell test, didn't look right, and a lot of laws were passed to.
Well, Bo ran chicken operations, and so he didn't have a good sense of smell. I think he had.
I think that's one of the things I love most about Texas politics are just the stories. So, speaking of that, going back to the building, when you walk in, you see those beautiful paintings, and in the chambers as well, there's beautiful public art that's historic. But you walk into the rotunda, and so there's the whisper gallery thing. So tell us about that, how you can stand in one place and whisper and it can be heard. Have any secrets or things that weren't supposed to be heard in the rotunda there?
Well, that's inevitable, yes. The architecture is such, and the materials used are such that in a domed building, standing in one place and whispering, you can stand in certain other places and with great clarity hear what is being discussed 50 feet away, 100 feet away. And so, yes, I don't know any specific stories that...
Or is unwilling to divulge them.
That's right. But yes, it's inevitable, and it's fun for your kids. I'm sure they love it.
Yeah, they loved it. And that actually, that we have that in common with our national.
Yes, same thing happens at
there.
the national capital. It is. And one of the things I liked a lot about it is when you talk about seeing the history, the portraits of the governors and presidents of the Republic of Texas going back all the way, and it does give you a sense of sort of...
Right. The last portrait hung was Rick Perry, and so going around in order, even if there's successive terms, Bill Clements is shown twice with Mark White in between. And so you can keep going up the galleries and see all the way to the beginning. And it's just, you're right, it's a great history. There is one bust on the main floor, and it's the first female governor of Texas, Miriam Ferguson, who served in the 1930s. She was dealing with issues then that we're dealing with now. She was asked at a press conference what her opinion was of the teaching of English as a second language, and she famously said that if the English language was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the school children of Texas. And so while the questions are the same over time, maybe our answers get better as we go along.
Ma Ferguson, you gotta love her.
Yes, Ma and Pa Ferguson.
Well, and I will say that was another favorite thing for the kids to do, is to go and find the first president of the Republic and then just really... And it just, if you're a good teacher and you're teaching Texas history as you should, it really does just align so well with what the kids have learned and makes it real for them. Because it's one thing to read it in a book. It's another thing to see it.
Preston Smith, one of our governors, wore glasses because he was fairly plain looking, bald and nondescript. And so he wore glasses that he didn't need with no glass in them. And in slow days in the Capitol, if he heard school children down in the gallery rotunda, he would come down and talk to them and actually stick his fingers through his glasses to entertain them.
Okay, so in his portrait, does he have glasses on?
He does.
Because I'm going to have to go. Now, next time I go, I'm going to go find Preston's portrait.
Yeah.
That is amazing. I've been to the Texas State Capitol. We try every time we're in Austin. If we're there any time, I try to spend a little bit of time, at least on the grounds, or go in and whatnot, because it is, to go back to your adjective. Inspiring is the perfect word for it. The trip that I remember the most, we were there for the Austin Book Festival, which is close to the grounds. And it was, unfortunately, that day was the day of the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. This has been probably
10 years? It's been
not quite 10 years ago, but a while back. And I was really down about the state of our body politic, if you will. And we went in and saw, there's book festival, so there's a lot of people there.
And the book festival, they actually have it in the Capitol, so
Right.
you can hear different speakers and authors.
Right.
Like you can sit in one of the chambers.
Like you could sit in
Brian's
Brian
former
McCall's
seat.
desk, right? And so you have that opportunity. So, but I went in, and in the rotunda on the bottom, what's the design at the bottom of the rotunda on the floor?
It's a
I forget.
star.
Is it a star? I think it is.
Yeah.
I'm not.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everybody likes to have their picture taken. And, you saw the sort of hope and the idea of what we can be. And it actually occurred to me while you were talking about the first generation, the people today, that you're educating those sort of people. They were, probably more fourth graders at that point. But it did give me a tremendous sort of, we have bad days, but we have, institutions that will get us through. So, thanks to the XIT barterers,
Exactly.
the people, and so to Preston Smith and Ann Richards and George Bush and all of the people that have done that, and to Brian McCall. I get a little bit emotional about that.
He gets very emotional.
Right.
It's having the proper effect then.
Yes. And so when you're in Austin,
Whether you're our age or whether you're a kid, go to see the Capitol.
and
It's
make
remarkable.
time for it. Like, so if you're in Austin for a weekend, you think, I'll swing by and take a picture of it. It is, I'll put the Alamo first, but I would say it's our second biggest state treasure.
And just to be in a place where we've talked a lot about the funny stories, but so much meaningful legislation happens that touches our lives every day. It's powerful to know that people can come together and make decisions, and sometimes we agree with them, sometimes we don't, but that we have a process. And just seeing the building, because again, you read about it and you read about how our government works, but then to see the two houses, and then you can walk in the basement and see everyone's offices. It's really remarkable.
Another thing that's remarkable is Texas, if it were an independent state, nation state, would be the 9th biggest economy in the world, and it has a part-time government. What does that mean? That means that our legislators work part-time for 140 days every other year. They come to Austin, and then they go back home and live under the laws that they've passed. They get a minuscule salary, which means that they have things going on in their life. It causes us to have a really unique and interesting legislature, in that these people are back practicing law or teaching school or doing whatever it is they do full time, and then take a break to come be a citizen legislator. I hope that doesn't change.
Me too.
Well, the governor has the ability to make that change by just keeping calling special sessions. Were you part of special sessions that?
When I was first elected, I think under Ann Richards, we had 8 or 9 special sessions. But for the 10-year period that Bob Bullock and Pete Laney were in office as governor and lieutenant governor, they made certain that there was no need for a special session. In that 10-year period, it may be the only 10-year period in Texas history, there was no special session.
Well, those were two remarkable politicians.
Absolutely, yes.
I guess that's right. And Pete Laney probably doesn't get the name recognition that Bob Bullock does, but they both were.
They made George W. Bush the governor that he was, and regardless of what you think of anything else about George Bush, it would be difficult to dispute that he was not a remarkable, successful governor.
Yes.
Well, I encourage you to read more about the Capitol. The last little thing I found out was during the celebration, there's actually there was a waltz written for the Capitol Waltz.
The Capitol Waltz. You're not going to ask me to dance it, are you?
No, I'm not going to ask. There's no words either, so thankfully you can't sing it.
Well, that's, yes.
But it's just, there are remarkable stories around our Capitol building. And
one thing that we forgot to say is viewing the Capitol from the road.
Oh, yes. So this is one of my not early, I was in college, but I went to Baylor, and so I lived in San Antonio, so I would come and pass through Austin every time I drove home. And I mean, the Capitol was, you could see it unobstructed. It was the shining star. And there was actually a law, right, that said you couldn't build buildings taller than the Capitol. And if you've been through Austin now, it's much harder to see, but there are still laws for...
There's a corridor
right
from the University of Texas up Congress Avenue that the view is unobstructed.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the only unobstructed views now. Is that right? Sort of.
It is. Ray Hutchison, who was married to Kay Bailey Hutchison, the U.S. Senator and NATO ambassador, used to give tours of Austin. And as he would drive down Martin Luther King headed west, he would point to his right to the University of Texas and say, "This is the flagship of the University of Texas system." And then he would point to his left to the state capitol and say, "And this is its wholly owned subsidiary." So for tours like that, it's important that the view not be destroyed.
I do know that there's the bridge. Like if you go down actually Congress over the river,
It's unobstructed.
You can still look up there, and it's a great picture opportunity if you're a photographer, and it is again sort of, it gives you the scope of the Capitol because you can see it from a long way away, and so that's a great way to view it. And then there's all sorts of great restaurants on Congress. So
no question, yeah,
right.
So wherever you live, whether you live far West Texas, if you live in El Paso, if you live in far East Texas, you have to. I kind of think of it as a pilgrimage. I think every Texan should go to Austin and see the Capitol.
Well, it's a great city as well. The state capital city itself is 40 square miles surrounded by reality. It's well worth visiting.
And you can go to the Capitol website. You can schedule tours. You do need to schedule them. I think you're more successful if you do that. But definitely schedule a tour, go into the Capitol, do a guided tour. You won't regret it. Right.
Schedule the tour. Go to the museum, in the land grant office, and I will just reiterate, make sure you have enough time to tour the grounds themselves outside, and that you can just sort of wander around, which is a great thing. You can just sort of wander around the Capitol, and you won't be sorry that you did. And take your kids.
Yes. And so continue to join us here at Texas 10 and listen to our podcast or watch us on YouTube, and you always have the great things to say, all the things you can do.
Oh, do all the things, right? Subscribe, share, like, comment, all of that. Tell your friends. And word of mouth is the best way to accomplish that. So we'd love to have more people listening. And again, thanks, Brian, for your time.
It's been really fun to have
you back. Good to be with you.
And I'm glad to hear that you still have your wicked sense of humor. I love it.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
And I love this land. It takes my breath away. From the Palo Duro to the Gulf Coast plain, from the heart of the hill country to the piney wood shade, I love this land. It takes my breath away.